Previously on 49cc Scoot. I started working on my first scooter after 11 years collecting dust. I modified the front forks, installed a 220mm front disc brake, mounted a pair of radiators for a liquid-cooled conversion, redesigned the tail section, and installed a stage 6 speedometer. Now it's time to get the liquid-cooled engine in the scooter, but it needed some prep first. This is a 1E40 QMB Minarelli clone engine, bored and stroked with a TPR 86cc liquid-cooled kit. After sitting in the garage floor for a couple of years, it had enough dust and cobwebs to look like I pulled it out of a haunted house. I was using a racing cart belt-driven water pump with brackets and adapters that I made when it last ran because I was worried about having enough charging output from the MVT Digital Direct to run the lights and an electric pump for long rides. But I've since used an electric pump on the RC1 with an MVT, and it worked out just fine with less maintenance than any of the mechanical pumps that I've used, so I wanted to switch to electric on this build. A chunk of the engine came off when I removed the pump bracket. The corner actually broke off long ago, and I epoxied it back on and made this big bracket assembly to support it, which worked just fine until now. Once everything was off, I ground the corner so it didn't have rough edges. I didn't plan to use any cover over the ignition, so it should be fine this way. I removed all of the CVT parts and cleaned everything. The belt that was on it still had life left, so I put it back together as it was set up the last time that I used it. Kick Start parts were worn, and the support bearing for the primary drive shaft was so loose that it would fall out of the cover, so that needed attention. I took measurements and found that the bearing race was way off of what I'd expect, so I'd either have to use a different cover or shim the bearing. I had some 1/1000th of an inch thick shim stock, but this needed more like 8 or 9 thousandths for a press fit, so I cut up a soda can. The can was 4/1000ths of an inch thick, so luckily right on par for what I needed if wrapped most of the way around the bearing to double the shim thickness. I cut a piece that covered the majority of the bearing circumference and left it taller than it needed to be, because I've found it easier to work with shimming that way. My hands are in the way a lot, and there's certainly no great camera work here, but the bearing was cooled with freeze spray, and the cover was heated just a little beforehand. The tall shim helped to guide the bearing in a little, and then it was driven in with a socket close to the bearing's OD. Leftover shimming was cut away with a razor. The bushing in the cover was previously shimmed in because it was super loose otherwise, so I had to press that out. After a little cleanup, I used the soda can to shim a new bushing and pressed that in before installing the rest of the new kicker stuff. I use a bearing with a 12mm inside diameter in the CVT cover and then make my own bushings to adapt that to the 8mm drive shaft, because I've found that doing it that way and replacing the bushings as needed gives a tighter fit and better support in the long run. I started doing this before I saw Piaggio's solution of using an expansion ring to keep the drive shaft in contact with the bearing, which I liked much better. I'd really like to cut a groove in the shaft and start doing the same thing with the Minarelli at some point, but I didn't want to take the gearbox apart at the time. I did at least put some fresh gear oil in. If you want to build a racing engine for your scooter, or even if you want to repair the stock engine or build a sport setup, or get your 4-stroke tuned up, check out ScooterTuning.ca. They've got tons of parts, and orders over $200 ship for free. They also support this channel, so please support businesses that support our hobby. Once again, that's ScooterTuning.ca. The exhaust had a lot of surface rust, so I went over it with WD-40 and steel wool, and then rubbed it down with 2-stroke oil. The silencer strap was broken, so I made a new one from thick stainless steel that I had left over from doing the same thing on the RC1. I took the time to make up aluminum spacers for the silencer mount so it's a better fit and hopefully less likely to break the new strap. With that, the 86cc was ready to go in, but I had to get the old, I think 103cc, out of there first. I put concrete anchors in the garage floor for the tire changer that I use, so I used one of those to bolt a tie-down point to the floor, and that paired with jack stands was a pretty easy way to get the engines in and out. I found my 25mm Del Orto PHBL carb stored exactly as it was last used and noted the setup before cleaning everything and installing it. I wanted to get the floorboard and leg shield on so I could mount the radiators and route the coolant hoses, but the floor had a couple of broken tabs. Not long before this, a recommendation for a hot stapler under $20 came up on Amazon, and I bought it to see how it worked out for me, having only failed miserably when I tried to melt zip ties to fix a seat bucket in the past. Basically, you get a bunch of different staples that work for different repairs. You choose one and insert it into the stapler, and when you pull the trigger, it heats the staple. That gets pressed into the plastic parts that you want to join or reinforce, ideally about midway through, and then you release the trigger and let it cool for a few seconds before pulling the stapler away. I don't think this one got in quite as far as it should have, but I was pretty pleased with how simple it was. I added a staple to another section and then cut off the leftover metal legs. The instructions mentioned the legs coming off by hand, but I found it easier to cut them off and later learned to grind them down if needed for a flat surface. The repair was okay, but didn't feel all that stable to me, so I figured I might as well try a little bit of plastic welding on top of it. I just got a new soldering gun to replace an iron that crapped out during the wire harness mods, so I put the flat tip on it and did my best to melt and blend pieces of a big cable tie into the floorboard. I definitely didn't do a good job, but this process was much more successful than past attempts only using zip ties, and I could see that someone with patience could probably learn to do decent looking repairs with a couple of pretty inexpensive tools. Who knows how long it'll last, but I at least managed to bolt the floorboard on without snapping the repaired tabs off. I connected the radiators, top and bottom, with 1/2-inch heater hose. Then I added 5/8 of an inch heater hose to the inlet and outlet. That was a job. It looks like these radiators should have used 3/4 inch hose, but I made the 5/8 fit. I like the 2005 to 2013 YZ125 radiators on my other scoot much better because every fitting is 5/8 or 16mm, which is the size that fits the engine and the electric pump that I use. I lubed the grommets with WD-40 and fed the hoses through, but you can see it was a snug fit and not an easy task. The highest hose on the radiator inlet was routed to the cylinder head's outlet. I used a short section of hose on the cylinder's inlet port to mount the Bosch water pump. Some don't like this method, saying that the pump isn't secure or it would look better hidden, but the appearance doesn't bother me, and I've never had a problem mounting them this way. Attaching the lower radiator hose to the pump gives it enough support. If you are ever setting up a liquid-cooled scooter and hose routing is an issue, just remember to keep the pump on the cool side and that heat rises. So, cooled water from the lower radiator hose goes into the pump's inlet and then out into the cylinder or the base of the engine. And hot coolant exits the cylinder head and goes into the top of the radiator. I put the reservoir on and attached it to the overflow port near the cap. Then I filled the system with a little over a liter of 50/50 distilled water and coolant. Another thing I like about this setup is that purging air is always simple for me with the electric pumps mounted low, and it's done in a few cycles of the pump, which is not something I can say for some of the mechanical pumps that I've used. There was coolant under the scooter, but I didn't notice any obvious source, so I thought it was just something that I spilled and moved on to installing the carburetor. I'd prefer to use a modified airbox on big carbs, but there wasn't even room for the hose to the airbox, so I left that problem for another day. Once the tank was full, it was time to see if the engine starts after over 2.5 years of sitting. Not first kick, but I'll take it. After it was shut down, I found a coolant leak by the crossover port on the left radiator, so I drained the coolant back out and removed the radiator. You can see that the weld was rough where it leaked, so my first thought was that I should take it to a welder and get it fixed, but I had a product called Muggy Weld here that is supposed to be capable of repairs like this. It's more like a soldering process, where the area is cleaned, and then their own special flux is applied to the area and the filler rod. Then you heat the area with a torch, and once the flux turns brown, the filler can be melted. It looked okay after one attempt, but I added a little more on a second try. I think welding would be a better repair, so it melted and blended in with the material, but I didn't see any leaks in a pressure test, so I put everything back together, and I haven't seen any leaks since. That's it for this video, but make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss any future updates, and please give this video a like if you enjoyed it or found it helpful. Thank you for watching.